Hey, it's Putt Putt. Welcome to my channel. So I see a lot of people who get frustrated saying, they've only used their gear 6 or 7 nights or something, and their gear just isn't working properly anymore, or maybe their sleeping bag isn't keeping them warm anymore, something like that. Well, to be honest, a lot of times it is not about how many nights you've used your gear for, but it's more about what do you do with your gear when you're not using it. Where do you keep it or store it in the off season, and how do you store it long term? Say you're not backpacking over the winter, how do you store it over the winter? So let's quickly talk about your big pieces of gear, probably your most expensive pieces of gear, and how you should store them when you're not using them so that you get to use it for a really long time, for a lot of different trips and for many years to come. First up, let's talk about your nice, comfortable, warm sleeping bag. Now, most of us, when we're on a trip backpacking, we store it in the nice stuff sack, all compressed and stuffed to easily fit in our backpacks. Which is great, that's normal. You probably should be storing it that way in your backpack. However, when you get home, you do not want to be storing it in that compressed small stuff sack. You really want either the down insulation or your synthetic insulation to be able to loft and breathe when it's not being used. Storing your sleeping bag or quilt in a compressed way, like in that compressed stuff sack, will cause the insulation in your sleeping bag or quilt to lose its resiliency and also its ability to loft. Now, the lofting in your sleeping bag is what keeps you warm. If you store it compressed all the time, that lofting will now be a lot lower, and so your 30-degree sleeping bag will probably now only be good for, say, like 50 degrees. So that is not good. So you want to store your sleeping bag in the off season or for any length of time when you're not backpacking. You want to be storing it in a nice, breathable, large storage sack, which your sleeping bag probably came with. Now, make sure that that large storage sack is breathable. You don't want it getting mildewy or moldy in the off season. Now, if your sleeping bag did not come with a storage sack, just find something, a large bag, where you could put your sleeping bag in where it can fully loft. Maybe a large reusable grocery bag or something like that. Now, before you do store your sleeping bag or quilt in that large storage sack, you do want to take it out of its small compressed stuff sack, lay it out, let it loft, for at least a few hours or so. Make sure that it is completely dry and just let it sit there, let it loft before you put it in that large storage bag. So same scenario with your Puffie. Some people like to store their puppies nice and compressed in a nice little stuff sack in their backpacks on trips, which is fine. But once you get home, you want to be allowing your puppy to breathe in a loft. So I generally just store my puppies out in the open, not in a bag or anything, just laid out flat, allowing it to loft in the off season. Next up is your nice, expensive tent that you just did a lot of research on and spent a lot of money on. Now, when you're backpacking, of course you're gonna store it in its nice little stuff sack. But once you get home, make sure you take it out of its stuff sack, make sure it is completely dry. If it ends up with any mold or mildew because it was not dry when you put it away, then, mold and mildew is not good. It's gonna end up smelling and it can also actually end up damaging the waterproof coating on your tent. Now, while you've taken your tent out when you get home from a trip, you should probably also spot clean it with just some cold water and a rag if you notice anything like bird poop or anything like that, because that can also damage your tent in the long term as well. So just go ahead and wipe it off with a cold rag, and then let your tent just sit there and wait for it to completely dry. Now once you're done drying that tent, don't just shove it back in that stuff sack and store it long term all compressed and stuffed in that stuff sack. You wanna maybe just kinda, not fold it with a crease, but kinda leave it laying out and open. So what I do is I loosely fold it so that I can just store it on top of a bin or something like that. You don't wanna store it in a closed bin, because that can also cause mold or mildew in the long term. Also, wherever you are storing that tent, it should, to the most part, be in a cool, dry place. If you live somewhere where it's super hot, like Florida or like southern Arizona in the summer, you don't want to be storing it in, say, your hot garage or in your hot attic, because that also will affect the waterproofing. It'll start delaminating, flaking. Just make sure that you're storing it in a nice, cool, dry place. By now, I'm on the Arizona Trail, hopefully making some videos for y'all. If you feel inclined to help me out by maybe donating a little bit to help me purchase a meal in town, or maybe purchase some food in town for a resupply, that would be awesome. I have a link down below. I think it's called Buy Me a Coffee. So yeah, that would be awesome if you want to do that. Obviously, you do not have to. Don't feel like you have to. I would be doing this trip anyways. But anyways, back to the video. Next up is gonna be your sleeping pad. I know a lot of people will leave their sleeping pads all stuffed in their little stuff sacks in the off season. And honestly, you don't really want to be doing that. Same as your sleeping bag and your tent, you should be trying to store it open where the air is flowing. You don't want it to get moldy and mildewy. You want to be storing it nice and open and loose. The other reason you want to be storing it nice and open and loose is not just to prevent mold and mildew, but also if you're folding it and rolling it and leaving it in that stuff sack for a long amount of time, you're also causing your sleeping pad to get creases that may affect your sleeping pad in the future. That's where you could potentially start getting holes in your sleeping pad, and that would not be good if you're in the middle of a trip and you pull your sleeping pad out and you try to blow it up and dang, it's not actually blowing up anymore. So you want to store it loose. A good idea, if say you don't really have too much space to be storing your gear loose, is just take a clothes hanger and drape your sleeping pad over the clothes hanger and store it in a closet. Now I wouldn't store it in a super closed, tight closet. I would store it in a closet that is pretty open. Maybe leave the doors open in your closet. That is how I would store it. Alright, so moral of the story is most of your gear, keep it nice and open, lofty, loose, not tight and compressed. That's pretty much all I have for you today. I didn't want to waste a lot of your time, but I did want to talk to people who might be frustrated about their gear not lasting long and give you some pointers. As always, thank you so much for watching, and hopefully I will see you all in the next video.